What's going on, everyone? If you haven't heard, Sony recently released the Sony A9 III, which is the first full-frame camera with global shutter. And while this technology is groundbreaking for the photo industry, it's left a good amount of questions. One of those questions is how it works with flash and if it's better than high-speed sync. But first, I want to give a huge thank you to Sony for sponsoring this video, and although they supported this video, the comparisons are unbiased. Now, before we answer the question of today's video, I need to explain what this global shutter is and how it works, especially in relation to flash photography. Now, in order to do that effectively, we need to start at the beginning. So cameras of the past have used traditional mechanical shutters, where we have a physical moving mechanism that allows light to hit the sensor. When it comes to flash photography, we have always been limited to the speed to which these physical mechanisms could move. So if my face is the sensor and my hands are the shutters, what happens when you take an image is one shutter opens and the other closes, then resets. Once the shutter speed gets high enough, the second shutter needs to start closing before the first curtain has finished opening. Eventually, you end up having a little slit for the light to go through as the shutter moves across the sensor. Now, if you fire a flash when there is a partially closed shutter, then that shutter is blocking the flash's light from hitting the sensor. So we're limited to what's known as sync speed, which is the fastest shutter speed possible, where the first shutter has finished moving and the second shutter has not started to move, which brings us to high-speed sync. This is a functionality that some lights have in order to get past a camera's sync speed. So for situations where there is only a slit between shutters, instead of the flash giving one big pop of light, the light gives a bunch of very fast pops in order to expose the sensor as the shutter moves across the sensor. The problem is that the instant you put your flash into high-speed sync, you essentially lose about a stop of power. And the higher up you go in shutter speed, the less potential power your light can give you. Now, when it comes to traditional electronic shutters, we are no longer limited by a moving mechanism. Because of this, electronic shutters can give us higher shutter speeds, but we are now limited by how fast the data can be pulled from the sensor. What's happening is instead of a moving shutter letting light touch the sensor, we are basically turning the pixels of the sensor on and off in order to gather light. The problem here is that while we can have these pixels turn on and off very fast, we can't read the data from the sensor with the same speed. This is why traditional electronic shutters suffer from what's known as rolling shutter. What's happening is that while the pixels can gather light very fast, it's only doing so line by line. So if you're photographing a fast-moving subject, your subject might be on one part of the frame when the exposure starts and then on a completely other part of the frame when the exposure ends. This is why some subjects captured with an electronic shutter look kind of warped or skewed. This is also why most electronic shutters won't work with flash. This finally brings us to the global shutter. A global shutter is the same as an electronic shutter, but instead of reading the data from the sensor line by line, it reads the entire sensor at the exact same time, which means we can use flash. But remember where we were talking about mechanical shutters and the limitations of sync speeds, needing both shutters to be fully open? Well, now that the entire sensor is read at the same time at any shutter speed, this means that flash will sync at any shutter speed. But there's a catch. And I know there's a lot of technical things in this video, so bear with me, but flashes have what's called a flash duration, which is a fancy way of saying how long it takes for your flash to give you the amount of power that you have set. So for example, if I set my Godox AD600 Pro to 1/128th power, it tells me the flash duration is 1/8260th of a second. And if I take the same flash up to full power, it now takes 1/220th of a second to give me all of that light. So now that we no longer have a sync speed to worry about with the Sony A9 III, I can take images with flash at shutter speeds as high as 1/80,000th of a second, but it takes 1/220th of a second to give me a full power pop of light from an 8600. So how does this work? Now, the key here is that once a light starts to fire, it goes from no light to building up to its max potential, and then the light falls off until it's gone. Now, this looks like a curve. So if a flash duration is 1/220th of a second, and we have a shutter speed of 1/80,000th of a second, we are only capturing a small slice of that curve. But we want to make sure we capture as much light as possible. So if we have 1/80,000th of a second slice, we don't want to capture this part of the curve. We want to capture this part of the curve, which is why the Sony A9 III has what's called a flash timing setting. This allows you to adjust the timing of the flash and the shutter so that you can line up the moment of capture with the peak of the flash curve. This brings us to our question: is flash with a global shutter better than with high-speed sync? On one hand, high-speed sync doesn't give us the full potential of our flash, because it breaks that power across the shutter speed. On the other hand, with global shutter, we don't get the full potential of our flash because we can only capture a small slice of our flash duration. So to test this, we head to the studio. Here I have my original Sony A9 for testing the mechanical shutter, and then obviously the Sony A9 III for testing the global shutter. For light, I have a Godox AD200 Pro inside of a Magmod Magbox 24. For camera settings, both are set to 1/8000th of a second, f2.8, and ISO 250. And there's a video light on for recording, but it's not contributing anything to the exposure at these settings. For the mechanical shutter, the light is set to full power, and obviously high-speed sync is turned on. And as you can tell, the exposure is about where we would want it. Now, moving on to the A9 III, exact same settings and flash is still at full power. The only difference is that now we are using the global shutter instead of high-speed sync. And as you can tell here, even though we are only capturing 1/8000th of a second of the flash's 1/200th of a second flash duration, there is still about 3 stops more light than we got with high-speed sync. But there's more to this story, because while we had the light set to full power, the way the flash duration curve of this light is, with a global shutter, we capture the same amount of light at full power as we do if we have the light set to quarter power. This means that we can take images with lower flash powers while still getting the same results, which gives us better battery life and faster recycle speeds. Add to this that while we had maxed out on our shutter speed when using the original A9, we still have room to go on the A9 III. And even though we will gather less light as we go up in shutter speed, if you take an image at 1/80,000th of a second, we are left with an image that is properly exposed. So with a global shutter, we can get the same exposure with a much higher shutter speed and a flash set to a lower power when compared to high-speed sync. So what does this mean? While I tested this in the studio so that it was easy to see the differences without any outside contribution, once we take this into location lighting, we have a lot more flexibility in controlling our ambient light. So stepping out into my backyard, I set up the same Magmod Magbox 24 on my auto stand from Cheetah Stand. Starting out on the Sony A9, this is what a neutral exposure looks like. And we got here with ISO 100, 1/1600th of a second, and f1.8. Now, if we want to underexpose the ambient as much as possible, I can crank my shutter speed to 1/8000th of a second, and this is what we get with the flash set to full power using high-speed sync, which ends up being not quite enough light. So the way to work around this is we can drop our camera to its sync speed and then compensate by raising our aperture. Now we're at ISO 100, 1/250th of a second, and f10. Here we get more light because our flash is popping more efficiently, but we lose the option of a shallow depth of field. Also, our ambient light is as low as we can possibly make it with this current setup. Moving over to the A9 III and its global shutter, even though we have a base ISO of 250, we still have a lot more room to move our ambient exposure around because of the higher shutter speeds. So if we set the camera to ISO 250, f1.8, and 1/80,000th of a second on the shutter, this is what an ambient exposure looks like. Now, with the light set to full power, this is the result. But remember that the flash output is the same when comparing full power to quarter power, so I can actually turn the light down and get the same result. And you can see this clearly when I show these two side by side. What this means is that with the A9 III and its global shutter, we have a lot more control over the ambient light, all while using flashes at lower powers. And the point here is not to kill all the ambient light, though we can totally do that in a lot more situations than we were previously able to. For me, it's the fact that we can now have a lot more control while also using smaller and lighter gear. We also no longer need to resort to higher apertures and instead can rely on higher shutter speeds, which allow us to maintain a more shallow depth of field if that's the look we're going for. And there's still a lot more to unpack here when it comes to flash paired with the global shutter, let alone all the other benefits like no more banding, 120 frames per second, pre-capture, and everything else. Hopefully this at least answers the question of whether global shutter sync speeds are better than high-speed sync, because that's a definite yes. But if you have any other questions about flash and global shutter that you'd like me to dive into, go ahead and drop those in the comments. And if you found this video useful or informative, make sure to drop us a like and subscribe, as well as give me a follow over on Instagram at VincentImages_Jason. So with that, catch you on the next one.